It's another episode with Miss Clark, and we are talking about genetic drift, adaptive radiation, and endemic species. This all has to do with adaptation. It's not necessarily tested on the AP exam, but we think it's just good for you to know because a lot of it has to do with how adaptation happens. So let's go. So let's start with an endemic species. Endemic species are ones that are only found in one geographic location. So this could be a continent, part of a continent. Most of the time it's islands, and they're often specialists. Unfortunately, they're normally driven to extinction because invasive species come in generalists and they kind of change that ecosystem. So great examples of this are koalas, panda bears, where they're so endemic to that region because of the specific ecosystem that exists. Here's a great example, the giant tortoise. This is only found in the Galapagos Islands. Unfortunately, though, many boats came to explore the Galapagos Islands, and they brought pigs and they brought goats and rats, all these generalist species, and because of that, the population has dropped. Because they're such specialists, they require such a stable ecosystem that can't be infiltrated by these other species. Another one, the platypus. Australia is full of these endemic species, only in eastern Australia. And again, our numbers they're strong. However, there's been a lot of fragmentation of that habitat. A lot of different roads being built or different communities coming in, breaking apart these habitats, and for both for agriculture and for housing. And so it alters that ecosystem, creating many more edge effects. And we talked about how that edge effect impacts our specialist species. This is another one. This is the tarsier. It's the world's smallest primate, found in the Philippines. Again, very specific to this area. And the last one I'm talking about is the dragon's blood tree, really unique tree. It is in the Socotra Islands. So very unique. We don't see this really anywhere else because it's so well adapted to these islands. Now, as we've talked about before, islands tend to have these low levels of species richness, but they are going to have a lot of endemic species. Because when these islands are colonized, the population of this new early arrived species is so small. And when we have these small populations, they're very susceptible to that genetic drift, which creates new species. Let's talk about those. So, genetic drift. This is different than what we've talked about so far because this does not rely on pressure at all. No selective pressure. It is just a random event that happens. So when we have a very small frequency of genotypes, there could be an event that happens that removes a certain gene from that pool because a certain members are killed off. And when that happens, that means that that gene may disappear from the population moving forward. Here's a great example. So I have these cute little bugs here, and I have a combination of blue and red bugs. But wow, sweat, random, just a random chance here. And this sweat got rid of a lot of blue bugs. Happens, they just got unlucky. The blue bugs are just unlucky. And so that means now we are reproducing many more red bugs. And in the end, unfortunately, the blue gene may completely disappear from this species. Random event, no pressure. It's just a random event that is going to create a new species. As I mentioned, unlike natural selection, this is a random occurrence. It could be a storm, a fire, a landslide, who knows? Not driven by selective pressure. And because of that, that chosen gene may not be successful. It may not be better adapted to its environment. It was just lucky. So when we think of genetic drift, we need to think of luck. It was just a lucky chance. Now, this is most common in the early days of an island's colonization because our populations are small. And when we have small populations, it's much easier to wipe out a few members that have certain genes. It's harder to do that when I have a larger population. Now, we can kind of simulate this through what we call a bottleneck effect. So here's my population size, and then like whack, they're all smacked. We have a tsunami, who knows what it is. We have some event that drops the population size. Because of this bottleneck, only a few of them are going to survive, only carrying forward few genetic diversity. So our population eventually will recover, and you can see this here. The population does recover, but our genetic diversity does not. So this graph shows you the same thing. Boom, here's our event. Population recovers, but our genetic diversity never does. And that becomes an issue. Unfortunately, if this bottleneck effect is strong enough and our population size is quite small, it can lead to inbreeding. I know you guys have all heard of inbreeding before. It's the reason we can't marry our cousins. Inbreeding occurs when our population is extremely small, and therefore the individuals have to mate with each other. They have to mate with their close relatives in order to reproduce. It's the only option. The problem is, though, is that these inbred populations have a higher chance of inheriting copies of these defective alleles, causing genetic disorder that can become so prevalent. You need that diversity for a population to become strong. So here's an unfortunate example. Unfortunately, about 12,000 years ago, there was a bottleneck that occurred in the cheetah population. Right now, our cheetahs are so related that I could take one tissue from one and implant it into the other, and it would not be rejected. That's how similar that DNA is. It's not good. It means that, unfortunately, most of our male cheetahs are carrying this defective gene that's reducing the amount of sperm they produce. Not good for this population. Another example, you've probably seen these paintings before, and you're like, gosh, why do the artists paint it like this? Well, it's actually because this was a genetic disorder that happened quite often in European nobility, because they all wanted to marry their cousins and other European nobles who were all related in this big family. So this is called the Habsburg chin, and it was passed down, unfortunately, as a genetic disorder that led to increased incidence because we kept inbreeding, unfortunately. Another example is hemophilia and porphyria, where we have blue-colored urine and a mental disturbance. These are all issues when we start decreasing the genetic diversity by inbreeding. Now, the founder effect is a similar version of the bottleneck effect that happens when these small number of individuals settle in a new area. It could be birds colonizing a new area, etc. Where our genetic diversity is so low that we just have so many genetic defects, unfortunately. A great example here are the Blue People of Kentucky. This is a group that moved to a very, very remote area of Kentucky and started having families, and unfortunately we had a lot of inbreeding, and this genetic defect passed on, the genetic defect that actually turns their blood blue, so they have this blue appearance through their skin. And because they kept inbreeding, because the population was so small in this remote location, it meant that this defect kept continuing. So this is called the Blue People of Kentucky. Look it up. It's a fascinating story. Okay, so previously we have been talking about situations where these random chances have created new species or genetic drift. But now let's talk about how these new species evolve to fill new niches. So as we mentioned, that with genetic drift, we can have new species that are created. Adaptive radiation tells us that this will happen when unoccupied ecological niches are available. New species will evolve to fill them. So a great example, I'm going to kind of go back and forth. When the dinosaurs were around, almost all the niches were filled. They were already occupied. There were no niches left for these mammals. So you can see the mammals there were very few species compared to our dinosaurs in the Cretaceous period. Then our dinosaurs became extinct, opening up so many more niches. So therefore, our mammals evolved to fill all those different niches that were now available. So if we go back to the slide here, we could start with these few. We had rodents, we had ungulates, and we had insectivores. And all of those grew like crazy. They evolved to fill these new niches that were all available. And that's how we got everything from primates to our mouses, to carnivores, to whales, to elephants, to aardvarks, to everything. All these new species that exist here is because of the adaptive radiation that occurred after the dinosaurs died. Now, the last slide I want to leave you with is just continuation, some last notes about endemic species. We can also have endemic species in rainforests. If you remember, rainforests are one of the most stable ecosystems, and we need those stable ecosystems in order for our specialists to form. And what happens, even though we have so many different niches that are already filling within our tropical rainforest, we can actually create sub-niches. So that adaptive radiation can also create these sub-niches. And when those sub-niches are formed, species evolve to fill them. So many different bits of information that will help you have a larger perspective of how different species have adapted and evolved over the years.